I'm Jim Walker, president of the Stevens Point Area Genealogical Society, and I want to welcome you all here this evening. There are some faces that are unfamiliar to me, but we have our meetings the first Wednesday of each month at 7 p.m. and we try to present a program focused on genealogical research and help each other do this difficult task of finding out where we came from and who our ancestors were. So I want to welcome you here this evening and hope that you have fun. This is the first time we've done a sort of a genealogical roadshow, and those of you who follow the program on television know what that's about, but we sort of advertise it as a genealogical roadshow type program so that we don't have any copyright infringements. So it's a genealogical roadshow type program, and the subject is going to be the distinguished mayor of Stevens Point, Mike Wiza. So I want to welcome he and his wife here this evening. They volunteered to actually show up, which was a courageous move because I know that Pam promised that she was going to do an extensive research in certain aspects of the mayor's life to make it an interesting presentation for us. Without any further ado, I'd like to turn the presentation over to our Vice President, Pam Anderson, genealogist. Pam?
Thank you. The first thing I want to let you know is I did meet with the mayor when we talked about doing this, and he said that was fine. And I said, do you mind if I find some things that are scandalous? And he said no, he thought that was fine. And since I can tell he has a sense of humor, he's going to be perfectly fine with all the scandal I did find. I did not do anything on him directly because I figured if I was going to try to surprise him, he probably knew what he'd done, so that wasn't...
Well, and the statute of limitations probably hasn't expired on some of that stuff yet.
But in any event, I just figured that was it. And the second thing is I really have told some people, I really felt like I was doing political opposition research because there are quite a lot of things in the family that they had a lot of encounters with the law. So we'll start now. And the title, you'll get to find out, I'm going to show you a few slides before I get to it, but the title is Tarred and Feather, but No Justice. And I do have a law degree, so I'll explain some of it. So we'll go to the next one. Come on.
Where the idea of what that means, tarred and feathered?
It means exactly what it means.
Do you have any idea what the origins of it?
I don't know about that, but I do know that we had somebody tarred and feathered. That is a Wiza. So, and...
The tarred and feathered is a act of humiliation. Sometimes they would put giant heads on people and run them out of town. Tarred and feathered, they literally threw tar on you or some sticky substance, and then feathers.
But that's not how they did it this time. So
okay.
Anyway, I figured since it's a genealogy group, I would show you what name distribution can look like. And there are 3 different versions here of the Wiza name. And the most common, at least what they have on the website today from the Mormons, is with a Z. But you can see the distribution. When it gets to be red, there are a lot more people. When it's white, there's nobody. And then the other colors vary, and you can just look at it. The bad part is it used to be the sites you could hover over and it would come up and tell you what it was, and I don't think they're doing that anymore, or maybe you have to sign in. So the next spelling was with a Y instead of an I, and you can see there are not very many of those, and I tried an S as well, and there's only one area. So that takes care of surname distribution. But when you actually see a whole lot of them, often you can see where the center might be or looking, and that may tell you really where your ancestors might have come from, unless it's a huge city. So the next one, this is from 1925, and this talks about people who were new citizens, and you can see the yellow one, that's Peter Wiza, along with the other people who were naturalized in that time period. And this Peter, I believe, was born about 1850, I think. But now we get into the good stuff. Tarred and feathers for Sioux Line workmen. This is the headline of the Stevens Point Journal. Second man is beaten up on rural road. 2 men on way home seized, forced into cars and abused. Authorities take steps to give more protection to roads. So I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to read some of it from time to time, and I'll tell you some of it. In this case, I want to read the beginning because it's sort of flowery. The most flagrant case of lawlessness recorded up to this time in the continuation of the strike of the local Sioux Line shopmen took place early Friday evening, when 2 men filling strikers' jobs were kidnapped, taken out into rural districts in automobiles, and brutally assaulted. One of the men was tarred and feathered as well as beaten. The victims were John, it says W, but really it's A, Wiza, age 24 of Polonia, and William Mansavage, 35 of Custer. William, you're going to find out in different records in here, goes by either William or Valentine. And he married Anna Wiza, who would be a sister of John. So both of them are related to our topic here tonight. Both are now under St. Michael's, under doctor's care, and they're not seriously injured. And then they go in as a result of the outbreak of lawlessness attributed to striking Sioux Line employees. Civil actions for damages have already been started against the 3 men in behalf of Wiza and Mansavage. Criminal prosecutions are in prospect, and steps are being taken to afford more protection to the railroad property and employees. So it was a big deal. And then they go into how this all takes place. And Wiza and Mansavage were waiting at the Sioux Line tracks coming out of the lower yards, and they were caught at 6:45 on Friday evening. They think there were 8 to 10 people in the group that accosted them and forced them away. Wiza apparently was taken by 2 men, one on either side of him, and he was taken to a lonely spot in the town of Plover, where he was beaten and tarred and feathers and left lying in the woods. Mansavage was taken north to haul out on Jordan Road, a few miles north of the city, and was beaten. 4 men were in each of the parties that did the assaults. Mansavage was able to make his way back to Jordan Road, and he got a car to take him to Custer. And then Wiza was found by Mrs. Chester Van Order, who was out in Plover with her husband. And so he asked whether or not she could tell him where the telephone was, or where he could telephone. And so Mr. Van Order telephoned Dr. Rogers of the city and Sheriff Barry, and Sheriff Barry and his undersheriff came out to pick him up, and then they took him to the hospital. And they continued. When they went to pick him up, Wiza was found in the farmyard covered with blankets. So somebody had actually brought blankets for him. And after Wiza had been left at the hospital, they went out to find Mansavage, and they found him at his home in Custer, and they brought him back into the hospital. So then we have the district attorney, whose name was Byron Carpenter, and Barry having a conference, and then Sioux Line comes in, and they decide they need 25 people as extra guards to guard they mention it this way, company property and the workmen. So the property, I think, came first, maybe. Then criminal prosecutions were going to be started by the Attorney Carpenter just as soon as the evidence justifying it was placed in his hands. And they were looking for the people who had done the assault. They talk about it, they go back and forth, and they keep talking about it. They were seized about the Michigan Avenue crossing, and Frank Kasubi, I can't even pronounce his name. Kabishiak ended up being a guard from the railroad that was accompanying them. And so the question ends up becoming whether or not what he did too, although I don't think anybody ever figured that he was doing anything that was hurting the workers in the end. So we'll just sort of forget that part, but we will talk about him later. So Dr. Rogers attended the injured men, and he stated this afternoon that neither appeared to be seriously injured as far as he could determine so far. Wiza, he said, bore a mark of a severe blow on his head and another on his right chest. The injury in his chest was apparently inflicted by kicking or jumping upon him. Dr. Rogers stated Man Savage had marks at various places on his head and body. The black liquid applied to Wiza had the appearance of asphalt paint, the doctor said, and held feathers and pine needles. And the paint was removed by the use of kerosene, warm water, and soap. So if you ever get tarred and feathered, now you know what to use. Wiza was interviewed at the hospital, and he said he was 24 years of age and married, and his wife was at present with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. August. It should probably be an I, Latursky, 1 mile south of Custer. Wiza, according to his story, had been working on the farm of his father, Roman Wiza, at Polonia prior to hiring out to the Sioux Line. He had been working 5 nights and 3 days as a car inspector in the Wayne Street yards. Friday morning, he went to Custer and persuaded Man Savage, his brother-in-law, to return to him to work as a carsmith. The two boarded the passenger train number 5 at Custer and went as far as Stockton, and they got off there and started walking to the city. I don't think people do that these days. For starters, there's not the train. Reaching the yards, they were joined by 2 workmen and all continued walking west, bound for the eating car provided by the railroad company and stationed in the upper yard. So they were going along with the guard, and this was about 6:45. We were walking along the tracks near Minnesota Avenue crossing, and we noticed a group of men, probably 8 to 10 at the crossing. They entered the crossing and started toward us. One of them grabbed me. I turned and ran. But I didn't think they would follow me onto railroad property. However, 2 men caught me about 200 feet east of the crossing, one on each side, and led me off the track over onto Patch Street. A short distance east of where the Portage Branch crosses Patch Street, there was a Ford touring car occupied by 2 men, and I was forced to get into the automobile. And now we're going to get to these blank spaces where you can't say the words. I was getting into the car. One of the men said, "You," and we have 4 blank spaces. "When we get through with you, you'll look different than you do now." And then one of them hit me in the forehead and nose in his fist, and the blood started to flow from my nose. Another man said, "We'll take 4 more blank spaces and drown him." And another said, "We'll take him into the woods and tie him into a tree." After forcing me down in the back of the car, the automobile was started. One of the men asked me where I lived, and when I told him my parents lived in Polonia, he said they won't go that way. After traveling for some time, the car stopped. I was dragged out into some woods. The 4 men then started pounding me with their fists, and when I fell down, kicked me in the chest. Then they picked me up and stripped me to my waist. One of them started opening a can, which I am told contained asphalt paint. They put paint all over my head and body and threw feathers on. I was lying on the ground when they left, telling me not to make any noise. And then that's when we get to the part where the lady, Mrs. Van Order, comes and so on, and we'll skip the rest of it. And they say he was bruised and not seriously injured, and they removed the paint and all that. And he said he intended to go back to work for the railroad company as soon as he was able to be out of the hospital, which is an interesting comment. And then they were asking him if he recognized any of the men who assaulted him. Wiza said he was positive he would know one who drove the car, whom he recognized as one of the strike pickets. He said he was 35 or 40 years of age, short and stocky, and wore a black sateen shirt. He said he might also be able to recognize the other 3. Shortly after entering the Sioux Line employ, Wiza said he started up to town in his brother-in-law's car after having a talk with A.L. Fillmore, the Sioux Line master mechanic. He was the one who was hiring people. And we went over toward Water Street and then got stuck in the sand. Another car followed us, and when we stopped, 4 men came out, and they wanted to know why he was talking to Fillmore. So this was part of the problem. So anyway, we get back again to walking around Michigan. Man Savage's story is when he was interviewed, he was 35, lived in Custer, where he has a wife and 2 daughters. And he agreed pretty much with what Wiza had said. And we were on our way to eat supper when the trouble started. 4 men came after me at the crossing and forced me into a Ford touring car standing north of the tracks. The car started at full speed and driven out onto Jordan Road. When they grabbed me, one of them said, "You blank scab, what are you doing here?" And he was told that they were going to hang him. One of the men, he declared, hit him with a fist on the head after getting into the car. And after getting to the ground, one of the men came up and hit me in the forehead with his fist, and the other 3 joined in, taking turns hitting me on the head. And when I fell, they kicked me, and I was bleeding from the nose. And then they, finished and started away. I got up, and then he gets to the road and everything. So they described him as bruised and sore with many marks on his head and body, testifying to the beating he received. Asked if he could identify any of the men who assaulted him. He said he recognized one and he thought he knew his name. He also said he would return to work as soon as he was able. So that's quite a story to start out with. And I'm assuming you knew nothing about this.
No, not this one. That would have been
1922.
my great-grandfather's brother.
So anyway, the point paper has an editorial. I'm not going to read you all, just read the first paragraph. Felony has been committed in the railroad strike. The attack on the 2 Sioux Line workmen, elsewhere described in the journal, is a penitentiary offense. It goes without saying that every resource of the DA's office and the sheriff's office should be employed to put behind the walls of Waupun Prison the men responsible for the crime. When felony is involved, there can be no difference of opinion among good citizens. So that's what they say. So this, I thought you might be amused at this. These are men wanted, and this is from the 28th, and they're talking about the strike of the shop crafts, which is one union, and the firemen and oilers, which is another, and their vacancies, and they will pay time and a half for over 8 hours in the shop crafts and 10 hours if you were a fireman or oiler. And the rates are 70 cents for machinists, 70 cents for boilermakers, 63 cents for carmen, and so on. I have no idea what wipers are, but they're the lowest paid, and they get 32 cents. And also you can have free board and lodging for those who desire it. So this was probably a pretty good deal. So then we end up having some more workers on the Sioux Line taken up in cars and beaten and all. This is, on the 26th. The actual event started on the 21st. And so then they talk about Sioux Line strikers are examined under the discovery statute. And discovery is something in law that you do when you need to find facts. But the problem that people don't recognize in this case, and it gets very complicated, is you had a civil case and a criminal case. In a civil case, if you take the Fifth Amendment, you can infer that the answer you would have given would be against your interests. So if they ask you, did you kill somebody in a civil case, and you say, no, you didn't, I had an example that I worked with one time where that was a workers' comp case. And so we weren't charging with murder, but when he kept saying that, we believed, in fact, he actually had killed the person. So that's a problem. But they wanted for the criminal cases to know who the people were that could have been there or not there at the time that this incident took place. Well, eventually they ended up having a dispute, and at that time you had a county court and a circuit court, which is above it, which would be in that day an appellate court. So the appellate court ruled they had to answer the question. And the attorney for the defendants was Piffner, and it was Fisher and Cashin for the plaintiffs. So anyway, the examination of John Lumen, Highland Scribner, and Lumen Hurlbut was under the discovery statute. The judge was W.F. Owens, and they were brought into this for the kidnapping and assault part. So these are the questions you had to have. The names of all parties actively taking part in the assault, battery, and imprisonment, and to what part each party played. the names of all persons ordered, counseled, aided, and abetted in the assault, but did not take an active part, together with information as to agreements, promises, directions, orders, and counsels given and by whom in the aid of the assault. So they're talking about a conspiracy. And then they also get into whether it was premeditated and counseled by a number of other persons who did not take an active part. So Lund and Scribner and Hurlbut are all defendants. Lund and Hurlbut were ones that Wiza charged, and Mansavage charged Scribner. And they had a trial set for August 2nd. This is the Gazette also talking about they have many special officers now guarding the Sioux Line property. And the victims of the assault start civil suits and name 3 men. And they get into that. All of them pled not guilty, which is not a surprising thing. And this is where they do the complaint. And on the right side, the next to the last sentence, it talks about Valentine Mansavage plaintiff. And that's showing you he's been referred to as William all the way except for here. So I think probably his legal name was Valentine, but he went by William. So anyway, that's part of it. And here you see the Cashin and Fisher part. So then we get into the Gazette, and they go through a lot of more information. And I summarized a lot of what the people said. Scribner testified, and he said he left the railroad at 7 p.m. to drive to Ed King's store. 7 p.m. would mean he was still there after they took the guys. And these are the people that he said were at the picket line, and I'm not sure how, well, it's Hurlbut, which would be Lumen Hurlbut, Don Smart, Joseph, and I'm not sure what that's supposed to represent. It doesn't look like a Polish name exactly to me, but I don't know what it is. And then it's John Lund, Carl Zimmer, Irvin Altenberg, Herman Fletcher, and Emil Betschlock. He didn't see Barney Polchinski or Ed Graham. Now that doesn't mean, in the end he said, well, later he saw Polchinski on the line after these people had been taken, meaning that he would have come back after they left. So I don't know. This is the most weak testimony of any of them. They asked him, did he drive to the town of Hull? He said no. Did he see who grabbed the two? No. Did he see Lund's car driving away? He said no. Now we'll do Hurlbut. Hurlbut added to these other names Harlow King, John Lund, Buck Turner. Turner has a different name in another one. Alfred Chapman. He did not see Highland Scribner, Ray Cochran, Joseph Cassidy, or Otto Hundine. I don't know. And then he didn't see Barney Polchinski at the time of the conflict. He said also that there were less than half of the picketers that were there at the time of the chase later on. And he went home for supper at 7 o'clock. He saw company men there too, so he gives the names. Lund didn't say too much, but he's saying on the picket line were Scribner, Arthur Turner instead of Buck, and everybody else has already been mentioned. Scribner believed that he'd gone home, and he thought that he left the line. Lund thought he left the line at 10:30, that he'd stay there picketing during that time period. So the problem becomes they have to identify them. And they brought the people in, and none of them could identify any of them. When they're saying short, I have some information that I have in the packet of stuff for you that actually shows some military records of Hurlbut and Lund. And they're at least called medium height, although the one for Hurlbut, by the time of World War II, he was 5'7" and 200 pounds. And the Hurlbuts, I knew the son and the grandson, so I'm getting, if he looked anything like them, he wasn't really small. So I don't know, maybe he gained later years, but the papers seem to indicate he was the least likely to be guilty of the group. And the other ones I just really don't know about. But they did not have anybody they could actually agree to. But I think you have to look at it from this point of view. They were captured and kidnapped, and I don't think they were saying, now I got to remember what these people look like. I think they were saying, I got to survive. And if you do that, you probably don't really look too much at your captors, especially when they're telling you to shut up and they put you in the back seat. You're not going to see what the driver looked like if you didn't see him before. And so I can understand why they really didn't know who the people were. And nobody that was on strike was going to tell who actually did it. So that's why I entitled this Tarred and Feathered, No Justice. And I also want to point out, from my perspective, justice is really hard to come by many times for this very reason. You don't really know what happened, or you don't have the people who know what happened willing to testify. So that's a major problem. So anyway, they had the first hearing and they go through all this stuff and they don't get very far, except at the beginning. The first hearing was supposed to be Hurlbut's, and John Wiza thought that he was going to be picked up by the sheriff, and he was supposed to be there at 10 o'clock in the morning. And Man Savage came to his house, and eventually the sheriff gets there and picks them up for the afternoon part, but they had all these people subpoenaed for the first hearing that stick around for the second. So then they do Lund next, and I think it's Lund next. Yeah, I think so. And and so they testify at that one, but they just can't identify these people. So that's what creates the major problem. So they end up having the cases dismissed for all three, and they don't seem to go after anybody else after this. I wasn't finding anything on with their names, don't seem to be appearing in the newspaper records after that until 1924. And in this case, he goes by Valentine, and he says he files a case with the Wisconsin Industrial Commission. Today, that would be the Labor and Industry Review Commission. And he filed for disability for harm to one of his ears. And the problem ends up being, the Sioux line says he wasn't in the course of his employment because he was going to eat. And today I think the commission would rule differently, because if the employer provided food for you, that could be not a deviation from the course of your employment. And they were providing food for them because they wanted them to be able to eat and not have to go off the property and run into the strike or the pickets. So I don't know how the claim came out. There wasn't anything in the paper after this. And those kinds of cases are not likely to have survived because they don't keep a lot of them unless it made it to the court. So that's the tar and feathering. So now I'm going to give you a number of other things. This is from 1923. John Wiza of Rosholt remodeled the building, which was recently occupied by Halverson Barber Shop, and will convert it into a grocery store in 1923.
You have no idea how funny the Wiza Halverson thing is.
What? Okay.
The former mayor was Mayor
Oh,
Andrew
I
Halverson.
understand. I do understand. I was thinking you met in Rosholt at this time.
No.
That's why okay. So then I thought you would be interested in some of the advertisements in the paper. And this is a party dance at Stockton Hall in 1931. And it says Wiza's Orchestra from Chicago. And Wisconsin and Illinois and Michigan, there are a lot of Wizas back and forth, and a lot of people Polish from Wisconsin went to Chicago and back and forth, so that's not a surprise. But in 1932, it now says dance, and it's the Wiza Orchestra. It doesn't say Chicago, and they're charging 25 cents admission. And there were other ones, but I figured that was a good sample. This is the grand opening of the Wiza grocery store in 1937 under Nick N. Wiza, and I'm not sure exactly where he fits in. But anyway, he had the grocery store then. So we got another interesting court case here. Peter Pollock of the town of Sharon was charged with larceny and taken to court, and his bond was $500 and he couldn't make it, so he had to stay in jail for the trial. And the complaint was from Alex Wiza, who alleges Pollock entered his house on June 20th, carried away a coat, a vest, a razor strap, shaving brush, silk handkerchief, and $2 in currency. The whole being valued at $29.25. And we don't know the result of the hearing, but we know that this happened. And that's 1913. So now this is one you may or may not know about. Do you know about this one?
I know this one.
So we have Point Santa Clauses get fined $50 each.
You're getting a little red.
And there were 4 men ages 18 to 23 were fined $50 each in Portage County Court for soliciting funds Christmas Eve while dressed in Santa Claus costumes. Dennis Wiza, Thomas Wiza of Stevens Point, and Jerome and Gary Wiza, Route 2 Rosholt, pled guilty to reduced charges of disorderly conduct. They had been charged with theft by fraud by soliciting money for charity. The quartet of brothers and cousins was arrested about 8:30 after Stevens Point police received several complaints for the 4 intoxicated Santa Clauses. The 4 said they were following an old American Polish custom of Rosholt, Custer, Polonia, and Amherst Junction, calling at home to give peanuts and candy to children and kiss pretty girls in exchange for a drink of holiday cheer and a donation to charity. The 4 said they were collecting for the United Way. When arrested, they had $362. Judge Robert Jenkins ordered the collections turned over to the United Way. So
I can't believe you don't know about the old Polish tradition of dressing up like Santa and getting drunk.
I never heard of it, but you know, this one I'm going to mostly do the Nick part on this one. This is actually from the Green Bay Gazette too. But this is out of Wausau AP, so it was really Stevens Point. Nick Wiza pled guilty here to federal liquor law violations. And they had bonds of, well, there were 2 guys. They had bonds of $1,000 and $500. And Wiza was charged with possession of an unregistered still, mash, and liquor. And so, and the other guy was charged with violation of the Internal Revenue Law, meaning he wasn't paying the liquor tax.
That was Christmas in July.
I think so. Now this one is from the Sheboygan Press Gazette, but this is still a Stevens Point case, 1936 again. And this is Nick Wiza was at liberty today because federal Judge Patrick T. Stone decided the need of the Wiza family for him outweighed the U.S. government's demand for retribution. Nick was sentenced to 6 months at the September term in the court in Superior for operating a still in the town of Polonia near Stevens Point. A stay delayed beginning his term until December 20th. Stone received a pleading letter on November 30th, and yesterday the entire Wiza family confronted him in court. A young blonde mother of Wiza's brood was tearful. An infant in her arms nuzzled the nipple of an empty bottle. Their plea was reinforced by a squalling of a bewildering toddling Wiza in the rear of the oak panel courtroom. Nick informed the court that he'd made no provision for care for his family while he went to jail. Judge Stone asked Mrs. Wiza what means she had to care for the family. None, she sobbed. How can I, all alone in the house? How can I do the chores? How can I milk the cow with nobody in the house to watch the kids? And the cow hasn't got nothing to eat. The pump froze up. Thanksgiving night it was cold already. The pump won't work and I ain't got no water. What can I do? Judge Stone turned to Nick. I guess you're all through working around stills, aren't you? He asked. Nick nodded in slow comprehension. You better be, Judge Stone warned him. Go home and care for your wife and children. So we do it. I'm throwing in a few things here. This is an 1897 marriage thing, but the person here was not a Wiza originally. This is the second marriage for both these people, but she fits in someplace. And the next one is a Rose Wiza who married Nick Chilla in 1920. So this is telling you the time period when they would have gotten married, more or less. Now we have an obituary for August Wiza at 28. He was the son of Peter, and he ended up suffering from tubercular trouble for a long time. So he had tuberculosis, and he leaves a brother Barney and several married sisters. And so he died in 1925, and I don't think he's on the list as dying. I mean, I'm sure he did, but.
Yeah, pretty sure.
And now we have Valentine Alex Wiza, and he died in 1933.
Well, no, this is funny because I live at 717 Franklin Street.
Okay.
So apparently there were Wizas there before us.
And of course, there were two different times that Stevens Point renumbered the streets. So they did it in the 70s, or maybe it was 60s, and they did it somewhere in the 20s. So anyway, he died in 1933, and he was married in 1910, and is survived by his wife and one brother and 4 sisters. And he's also, Peter Wiza is his father. Now we have one, and this goes back to Nick again. And this is the baby that was in court in 1936. She dies in December, not very long after he would have gotten out. She was 4 months old, and they had a funeral for her. And part of what I want you to notice on this one is all the pallbearers are women, which is sort of interesting. And she was born August 16th, and her death was caused by suffocation as a result of a blanket accidentally covering her face. So anyway, that's what happened to her. Now we have Nick again. Nick is really quite, I actually have a lot I'm not even showing you about Nick. So he must have had an attorney ready at any time. But in this case, I think this one he handled himself. Both Nick and Anton Gagas both ended up charging the other with assault and battery. And they had different judges, and and Nick had Ed Larson, and so he withdrew the complaint and paid court costs. And he got the better bargain, and Gagas ended up having Judge Murat, and he had to pay a little bit more money for the costs. So they were both dismissed. Now we go to Barney. And Barney ended up having his wife turn him in. She complained to Judge Park that liquor had been sold to her husband. And she accused Frank Cluck, who conducts a saloon in Sharon in Little Waupun. And I didn't even realize that there was a Little Waupun in town of Sharon. And Sheriff Guyan is taking steps to fully investigate the matter and states that an arrest will likely be made. The penalty for conviction is a fine of $10 to $50 or imprisonment in the county jail for 1 to 3 months. And Wiza is a farmer. Well, 20 years later, Barney goes to the big house. He's 55 now, and he was sentenced to serve a year in state prison at Waupun after pleading guilty before Judge Byron Park in Circuit Court and on the charge of operating an unregistered still. I mean, you got to pay the government taxes. And he lived on Highway 66 3 miles west of Rosholt, and it was raided by the State Treasury Department agent John W. Roach on Saturday. And they found 25 gallons of moonshine, which had been placed in operation that day. And I don't know how they knew it was going to be there then, but by gosh, they did. So Sheriff Heitzinger took him to Waupun after he pled guilty. Now we end up having a divorce case. And this is Elnora Wiza against Bernard Wiza. And this is in 1918, which is pretty early for women getting a divorce. And she ended up getting divorced. She got custody of the children, and they lived in the Little Waupun area of the town of Sharon. Their property was worth $12,000, and Wiza had half an interest in it, and his wife was given 1/3 of his half interest, and then he was to set aside $1,000 to support the children for 10 years. I don't think that would work very well today. And then he had some sort of an endowment insurance policy that was going to mature next year that he had to pay up. And then they could maybe change it around if she wanted to settle some other way. But at the end, they say they were married 14 years, and the farm belonged to Mrs. Wiza, who on her marriage deeded half of it to her husband. And I have a feeling she probably made a mistake. Maybe more than one. So this is another one. This is another example of that. And and I was going to take it out, and apparently I didn't. This is a car was hit by a truck that came from out in the country. John R. Ross on Main Street reported to the police that his car was hit at noon in front of the house, and the driver had a farm truck which stuck him and failed to stop after the accident. And then they had a witness to it who got the license number, and so they sent Harold Thompson, who was a traffic officer, out to see Walter Wiza. And Wiza said he didn't strike the car, but he stopped at the scene of the accident, and there was a fender and a taillight on Ross's car that were damaged. So I don't know what happened, but that's what we know. Now we have an interesting two articles together, thefts of cattle from farm. 2 cows and 2 calves were stolen from the farm last night, Barney Wiza of Sharon reported to Sheriff Heitzinger. Wiza told the sheriff the cattle had been left in the barn. Well, the sheriff is really on it. The next day, the disappearance of the cows are solved. His father, Peter, owned the cows, and he came over and picked them up and didn't tell his son. A good result. This one I'm showing you because legal notices can be helpful sometimes. And this one tells you where Rose Wiza lives. She was applying for a retail liquor license, and it gives you what her address is and what part of the section and how many acres and all that kind of what lot she's on in the town of Sharon. Now we have the cattle rustling. Now this one you may know about, or do you?
I do.
Okay, I thought this was one of the more unusual ones that I have seen.
Yeah.
There were a couple of men arrested for rustling cattle, were herded into the county court Wednesday by the sheriff's department, charged with stealing cattle on 3 different occasions from the same farm. Lowell Stull, 28, pleaded innocent, and Lawrence Wiza, 18, pleaded guilty. Both are from Route 2 Rasholt. In addition, Stull pleaded innocent to contributing to the delinquency of minors. Wiza pleaded guilty to driving without an operator's license. And the sheriff talked about the incidents. The first one was last Wednesday on October 3rd. 2 men and 2 juvenile boys went to the farm in Sharon, entered a barn, took a heifer valued at $25, placed it in their car, and drove to the Stull farm where they unloaded it. The next day, 2 men and 1 juvenile repeated the act, this time taking a heifer valued at $75. They then telephoned the Stevens Point cattle dealer, who came to the Stull farm and bought it for $50. So that's a real good profit when you don't own it. 2 days later, on Saturday, Wiza and one of the juveniles again went to the farm and again took a $75 heifer, which they brought back to the Stull farm, and then they sold this one to the cattle dealer for $40. The loss was reported to the sheriff's department, which rounded up the alleged perpetrators.
Well, my guess is that they had to make money somehow. They shut down their still.
Anyway, but Lawrence wasn't the one that had the still, but is he the son of Nick?
No. No. Lawrence is the son of Stanley Sr.
Okay. Anyway, so we got this. So the young boys involved were referred to juvenile authorities. The traffic court against Wiza was brought because he drove the car without the car the first time. And he was given 1 month in the county jail for driving without a license, plus 4 months for each of the 3 counts of theft. They will run concurrently under the Huber law. And then they also were ordered to pay court costs and restitution for the unrecovered animals. 2 of them had already been recovered. So that's that one. This is a much more pleasant one. There are a number of baseball things. I just gave one. And Polonia conquers Garfield 25-4. There were 3 Wizas in the batting lineup. And 1 played right field, 1 was catcher, and the other played second, and then 1 in his pitcher. And actually, the catcher scored more runs than Garfield because he had 6 runs, and poor Garfield only had 4. Oh, wow. So this was, they seemed to have a fairly decent team. The attendance was 225, and the time of the game was 1 hour and 50 minutes. But, you know, when you score 25 runs, that takes a while. So now we have 400 hunt for 5-year-old in the wilderness. and this is in Stevens Point, and more than 400 people, including 300 students from the university, trudged through the marshland and wooded areas in eastern Portage County throughout the night in search of a 3-year-old boy. Mrs. Nick Wiza said her son Maynard was playing in the family yard when he disappeared shortly before dark. And they live in a small home 14 miles east of Stevens Point. And they reported him to the sheriff's office, and they got the college kids involved.
Now, Pam, I'll give you some information there. Mrs. Nick Wiza is actually Rose,
Right.
who applied for the liquor license.
Okay.
This is the same Maynard that I was talking to you about earlier.
Okay.
Maynard was 5 in 1962, and he had some disabilities. But yeah, they lived out just north of Polonia.
And she was a Yenter, right?
I don't know. Yes.
Correct?
Yes, Lawrence's oldest brother says yes.
Okay. Sorry about that, but you know.
No, kids do stupid things.
And this is another one on Walter Wiza. At the time of World War I, they ended up having Liberty loan bonds. This is the 4th Liberty loan, and Wiza ended up buying one for $100. So he wouldn't have had to spend $100 to get it. It would be like the old savings bonds. Now we go to this one. I don't think is on the list in terms of who she married, at least. And this is another child, a person that died fairly young, and she had tuberculosis. This is again, pulmonary tuberculosis, and she had 4 children. And so she was another daughter of Peter Wiza's. So this is the map that I wanted you to see. And if you can look over in this area, this is Roman Wiza's property right here, and here's Frank Nitka's property right up
and
above.
I'll give you an idea too. This is Highway 66.
Okay.
This goes to Rosholt. That goes to Stevens Point. This goes into Polonia.
Okay.
So this is the Polonia area. What's Materos? Materos is right about here, which is the old Club 66.
Okay.
And there's Pat's Body Shop right here. And then Sacred Heart Church is somewhere in this area. This is that original homestead that my great-great-grandfather had. And I was telling people earlier, there was a legend of this, the Devil Stone. Stanley, do you remember this? The Devil Rock? That apparently was somewhere near a spring, and on certain conditions, the rock would weep.
Oh, good.
So it became sacred to some Native American people, and that's who I heard the story from.
Okay.
Didn't realize where it was until our community development director, Michael Ostrowski, says, my brother owns that house now, and it's for sale.
Okay.
Small world.
Yes, it is. But that's just section 9 out of the town of Sharon on that one, so it's an enlarged one. And now we have real estate transfers. Here's one where Walter Wiza sold some property in the town of Sharon in 1911. And here is where Roman bought land from Stanislaus Summers, 39 acres in Sharon for $1,600 in 1912. So I don't know if that's that property or not for sure. It isn't, or anybody know? Okay. This is Walter Wiza now buys land from Miss Finney, I can't pronounce her, Finney, whose parents had been pioneers in Portage County, and that's in 1913. And that's in Stockton. And now we have Martin Wiza of Custer buying a Zaborski place of 135 acres, and he had been a tenant on the land in 1936. This is in 37. Now we have Mrs. John Wiza having a problem in 1939. She was a victim of an accident in the marsh, and she lived 1.5 miles northwest of Polonia on 66 in the town of Sharon, and she lost her left leg at the ankle in a haymower in the marsh 7 miles from the Wiza farm. And she had accompanied her son Edward, 14, who was cutting marsh grass, and she was calling him to come to dinner and to leave the mower and the team of horses out in the marsh. And either he didn't hear or he misunderstood her and drove up while she was waiting for him. And she didn't see or hear the mower as it approached, and the sickle bar of the machine struck her leg, severing it except for a few tendons and skin. and the other leg was grazed by the machine. She did not know what had happened until she fell down and saw that her foot had been cut off. So the son ran half a mile to a neighboring farm for help, and she was carried from the marsh and so on, and she gets to St. Michael's Hospital where they amputated the ankle. But she'd also been grasping marsh grass and holding it on her severed leg. And then they also say that her husband was employed by the Sioux Line in Stevens Point, and it was in the city at the time, and he was notified of the accident. Now, he's the same guy that was tarred and feathered. Now we have the obituary for Roman, and the reason I put this in is I wanted to make sure you understood that William Savage's wife was the daughter of Roman. So it shows you here that Mrs. William is the first one listed, actually, instead of any of the boys. So, but John is also listed, and Frank and stuff. So now we have Joseph Wiza in 1924, also has a grocery store in Rasholt, and he has a complete line of groceries, watches and clocks, and he also does repairing and first-class work. And we're going to see what happens to poor Joseph. He dies in 1928, and this is a really strange obituary. It talks about the largest funeral ever held in northeastern Portage County on Monday was the funeral for Joseph Wiza, former businessman of Rasholt, who died at St. Mary's Hospital in Rochester, Minnesota. 118 automobiles were in the cortege.
Wonder how many cows were in there.
Huh?
Wonder how many cows were in
It
those
said
cars.
automobile. I don't think they let the cows go to. I mean, the church didn't accept them the day, except on the day that you bless the animals, right? Anyway, then they tell who the pallbearers were, and they tell relatives and friends who came from a distance. But some of the people who came from a distance were Stevens Point, so I didn't think that was very far. But it doesn't mention that he was married. It didn't say doesn't say who his parents were, anything like that. Well, now you see what happens next. Rasholt widow contests will of her husband. Hearing was being held today in probate court of W.F. Owen presiding. The contest was instituted by a widow against the will of the late Joseph Wiza of Rasholt, who died February 1928. He was a store proprietor at the village. Mrs. Wiza alleges at the time he made the will, he was incompetent mentally because of his illness, and he had been subjected to undue influence on the part of his mother, Elizabeth Wiza of the town of Sharon. The will against whose admission to probate the widow is protesting leaves $3,000 to the mother, $400 for the monument, $300 for masses for the repose of his soul, and I should go back to the other one. There are 3 different priests that give masses for him, and the balance after all the debts are paid to the widow. Well, the petition filed with the will by Elizabeth Wiza states that the personal property of the deceased was valued at $3,000 and that there were no annual rents or profits from the real estate. Wiza was the owner of the store and so on. And at the hearing this morning, they had people testifying, and Mrs. Teresa Wiza testified, the widow, and then they had CW cops come out there. So I don't know, did they end up with a cop store in Rasholt at that time?
There was an IGA.
1928.
Well,
Probably
I
not.
don't know.
So that's what I got.
Wow.
So did it live up? I mean, were you surprised?
I was surprised. There was a lot in there that I didn't know. And I don't know, I don't want to put him on the spot, but my uncle Stanley Jr. is here. You probably have a little bit more insight because those were your grandparents and great-grandparents, right?
Martin Wiza, I think, was the Glenn's and the other one.
Here,
Let me do this.
I can do that.
Thank you.
I can run. I
So
brought
everyone,
my
this
running
is
shoes.
the gentleman that's going to be talking is my dad's oldest brother, Stanley.
Okay.
And in front of him with the video camera is my Aunt Barb.
You want it? I'll sit with you for a bit.
The one I seen was Martin Wiza. I think that's a cousin to Frank,
Okay.
to my grandpa. Because Barney Wiza was Martin's dad.
Okay.
And well, I remember my dad always saying Barney was his godfather.
And what was the Barney thing that Grandpa used to do?
Well, that was Scruffy Dusky.
Oh, okay, different Barney.
Barney.
Well, that Barney was a son of Peter.
Yeah, so that's why
Okay.
I never heard of Peter.
Okay.
Peter and Roman must have been
Brothers,
Right.
they were. Yeah, Peter and Roman were brothers.
Okay, so Barney was Peter's son,
Yeah.
and then Martin was Barney's son, and then you know Glenn and Melvin, is it?
Yep, Glenn and Melvin.
They're Martin's
Okay.
kids.
Did they also have a son Alphonse or something like that?
Alphonse Ostrowski,
No, this was Wiza that was on the baseball team.
that I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see anything in this line, but this line is nowhere near complete. It's much further along now, thanks to you, Pam. I appreciate that. And I remember stories too. They talked about those two stills. I remember out at Grandpa's homestead when we used to walk around in the woods there. Every once in a while, we'd stumble across an old still. It wasn't used anymore, but the still was still there. Falling apart, rusted, and things like that. When we used to go running around in the woods.
Dick wasn't the only one making moonshine. Dick was, and my dad used to build cement silos, and you remember on my grandparents' homestead, that little silo.
Yep.
He had a gas pump there, and he was selling liquor out of there.
Yeah. Well, and now you can go if you go to Maryland Ballroom and turn south. The road tees. It's Maryland Drive. And if you head back towards Point, you'll see a small circular white building on the side of the road. That's where my great uncle, your uncle, Emil, lived. That little white silo, I'm told, was a tavern.
Yeah, my dad owned.
And I got to tell you, it was a sixth the size of this room. Seriously, I think my living room at my house is bigger.
The silo, it was, I think, 12 feet.
Yeah.
Most it could have been was 14.
But it was, it was a tavern back in the day.
Built cement silo. He did.
Yeah. So, how about shedding some light on that alleged cow theft?
I wasn't involved in that. I was a little ways away. I was in Ansbach, Germany at that time.
Right?
So I wasn't around. I volunteered for the draft when I was 18, and I left about a week or two later. So
Yeah.
I've heard about it, but I got more information today than I knew.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And Pam, thank you.
Sure. I don't know, maybe the Nitkas could come next year because they have a lot of scandal too, I think, from just the little I looked at today. So.
Nice. Thank you again.